Welcome to Roots of Faith. I'm Renee Richard, and today we're in Carville, Louisiana, at the Chapel of the Sacred Heart, which is located on the grounds of the former National Leprosy Hospital. It is actually a mission of St. Gabriel Parish, just up the road, and today we'll be exploring the history of this chapel, the history of the Daughters of Charity that served here, and I will be speaking with Elizabeth Schexnyder, who is the curator of the museum here, who has all of this wonderful, valuable history in her hands at the museum. Join us as we explore Sacred Heart Chapel. Elizabeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We are here inside this beautiful chapel, but this is actually the third chapel that have been on these grounds, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
I mean, with the Sisters of Charity coming here, they expected to have religious services
Right away.
And so that very first one was in a slave cabin, correct?
That is correct.
But
Within
they
24 hours.
I mean, they improvised. Tell us a little bit about how they improvised that structure to suit their needs,
They were
right?
very creative about that. They brought fabric and stretched it, sheeting, and stretched that across the walls.
Real tight.
Tight.
The records show that it looked like plaster, huh?
That is correct. You did your homework. They also brought a piece of linoleum.
And they said it was a beautiful pattern.
They
They
did.
didn't
They
elaborate what
did.
it looked like, but it was a beautiful pattern.
They had the church things were donated by St. Stephen's in New Orleans, so they had an altar and statuary. So they made it happen within 24 hours, and they recruited a local priest, Father Colton, and he came in and he said Mass for them within 24 hours of them arriving.
That's right. They were very adamant about that from the
They
research
were.
that I did.
It was in their
And
contract.
That is. The chapel, that first chapel, though, lasted not quite 10 years.
That's right, about 10 years.
It's about 1906, right?
That is right.
And at that point, there was a need, particularly with more patients arriving as well, right?
Not only that, remember, that's when the state actually bought the property.
Okay,
So they
you're right.
decided, hey, we need a permanent chapel and a
they-
larger chapel.
They don't build it. The government doesn't build it. So they
they
had
don't.
donations. I think I read $7,000 from the newspaper, from the
That's right.
Picayune, as well as from a support group in New Orleans as well.
That's correct. They had what they called the Leper Home Society for
I'm glad my mind went blank a while
That's
there.
right. So, yes, that's right. So when they figured out that the state would purchase the property, which they did, they'd start building permanent structures, and one of the things they built right away was a larger chapel.
So, and it served for both the patients
That's
as well
right,
as for the
patients
staff.
and staff. Now, of course, the Daughters of Charity would have been regular chapel goers, but we did have, by that time, Catholic employees here, because this was a very Catholic part of the country.
It is. And as far as the patients that were here, were the majority of them Catholic? I read that down the road
At that point in time, probably yes, because remember, they rolled in,
from New Orleans.
well, quite a few of the patients from the Louisiana Leper Home became the first federal patients, and that was about 90. So it split between, they probably had a majority Catholic and then a minority Protestant. So of course, the Protestants would send a minister here once or twice a month to administer to the
them.
Protestant patients, and eventually they built a chapel as well.
Right. So that second chapel that was built lasted to the 1930s.
That's correct.
When this one was built, correct?
This one was built and completed in 1933.
Yeah, and I read that, I don't know if it was dedicated or whether the first Mass was actually held on the Feast of the Sacred Heart,
That's
which
right.
is the name of this chapel. I don't know if there was any correlation with that. I think it was
Oh,
probably.
definitely.
It wasn't named that prior,
It
though?
was named that prior, but that's,
They timed it so that it
That
would
is
be
correct.
fall on that feast day, which is kind of cool. So let's talk a little bit about this beautiful structure that we're in. Of course, it is now a mission of St. Gabriel, but it was staffed for a long time by a resident priest here.
right. So the state of Louisiana, this church in the 1930s, we would have had by that time a chaplain, a Catholic chaplain, and he would have been hired by the federal government.
Okay.
Just like there'd be a chaplain accompanying any
Right.
military endeavor. We also had a Protestant chaplain that was hired by the federal government. An interesting thing, a little side note, is private fundraising built both the Protestant and the Catholic chapel, but then they turned over officially the building to the federal government so that they would maintain it.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So yes, we did have resident priests here from the 20s on to the recent past, 2003, I
Yeah,
think.
2002, 2003, when it became a mission of St. Gabriel.
Right.
And we were talking about private funding. This particular chapel was funded with a $35,000 donation from the Extension Society.
That is correct.
There's another word in there. It was National Extension Society.
I think it was the national offices. There was fundraising that went on a national level to build this chapel. As a matter of fact, the sister who was in charge at that time, her name was Sister Katherine Sullivan, and she became our sister in charge right before the fundraising began for the chapel, and her superiors in Emmitsburg said, Sister Katherine, you cannot build a chapel with a typewriter. But that's what she ended up doing. She just started communicating with Catholic societies across the country, and this became a national fundraising project for Catholics.
That's amazing. I didn't research that and all the diggings that I was doing here. So let's talk a little bit about the structure.
Yes.
Architecturally, it's shaped like a cross.
It is.
And it had, from what I understand, just talking earlier, not anything that I researched, but it had segregated areas.
It did.
Where the staff-
I have a copy of the blueprints on display in the museum, and I found out about 15 years ago when I got that copy that the seating was designated before the chapel was even built.
Wow.
So this was designated as the male patient seating area.
The main body
That's
facing
correct,
the altar.
the nave.
Okay.
And then behind me would have been the female patient seating area, much smaller, but it also has automatic doors that lead to the walkway. That was important for patients in wheelchairs so that they had access on their own, so they could come and worship on their own, but also come to regular services because they did have Mass every day. And then this seating area right in front of us would have been for the personnel, and that included the Daughters of Charity. So we have 3 entrances to this chapel. Actually 4. There's one for the priest.
For the priest to come in
Yes.
as well. So some of the stuff that are in here, I know that there is a very rare statue that actually came out of a church in Italy. The church was bombed in World War II.
That's correct.
And it's the only thing that survived the bombing unscathed, totally. But it dates back to like 1450.
1650s.
1650?
That is correct.
Okay.
And it was
I know it was very
donated by St. Lazarus Society. And they wanted us to have it, and we have it in a protective case now.
And rightfully so.
Yes.
All things considered.
Definitely.
Also, the stained glass window in here is beautiful.
Many
And it's done
stained
in
glass
2 different parts. You said one was done originally, and then the main body part was added, you said in the 80s?
Well,
1980s?
actually, there was no stained glass in the building originally.
Oh,
It was
wow,
all
okay.
ambered glass. And actually, the ambered glass is still there. It's just on the outside. It's a protective layer on the outside of the building. The interior has 2 distinct schools of stained glass. In the transom, which is on the left and right-hand side of the altar, it's a Spanish atelier,
okay.
a Spanish studio of stained glass. And it has a very different style, very different color-wise, a lot of symbolic images and Latin as well. So that would have been installed probably glass by glass in the 40s
Okay.
and maybe up to the 50s. Some of it is donated by organizations, and some panels are donated by families or patients themselves.
Okay, and then the ones that are
In the nave,
main
in this
body
main body of the...
were done in New York.
Right. The stained glass studio is called Lamb. It's a very famous American studio of stained glass, and they would have begun installing these in the 1980s, and it's all New Testament and very
More modern.
more modern, more naturalistic, and it's all in English as well. But what they all have in common is underneath there is a plaque, a bronze plaque that has the donor's name.
Oh, wow, so it's always identified for who that
Yes.
came from.
Right.
A couple of other things that I read about that, or I was told about here, is some of the artwork that was done by patients. 2 things in particular, a very large painting that was
Right.
painted by an inmate here, as well as framed, right?
Well, yes, it was done in the 1960s by a patient named John Carver. He was already an artist when he got here,
Okay.
but he he was probably Catholic as well, and he made friends with quite a few of the patients of Latin American extraction who we had here in the 60s and 70s. And he did for them a very large painting of the Virgin of Guadalupe, who was the patroness of Mexico, but she's now the patroness of the Americas.
Okay.
The painting must be about 10 by 8, and it was framed solid wood with a solid wood backing by one of our staff members who was a carpenter, a local man. And I was told that it weighs about 500 pounds.
Oh, my goodness.
Which I believe, right, because...
So it's on the wall and it's staying on the wall.
It is, but interestingly enough, it didn't always stay on the wall. When we had a feast day of the crowning of the Virgin Mary in May, it used to be taken down from the wall and suspended over the altar.
Yes, because that was a big feast day.
Big feast
May
day.
crowning was a big thing here.
Big deal here, yes.
So going back to the other piece of artwork that's here in this chapel, under the stairwell, when you walk in the door to the right where the stairs go upstairs, there's like a grotto that was done by
There is.
another patient, right?
There is. Well, the grotto itself was formed, and there's a statue of Jesus and an angel there, or an angel and
And Jesus.
And Jesus, right. The statue was donated from a New Orleans chapel. I don't have proof, but I think everything in here of statue was donated by New Orleans churches. But the grotto itself, the concrete work, was done by a patient, a young patient from Los Angeles. The sisters make reference to it in their archives. And I think his name was Joe Smith, but it might have been an alias. And he was a stonemason by profession and a
So
bricklayer.
that's actual stone?
I
It's
don't
not
think
shaped?
so. I think he
Oh.
shaped it out of concrete.
To
Yeah, I'm not sure.
mimic it or look like it, right?
It's still there, and it still
beautiful.
looks, it's still in great shape. Unfortunately, he didn't live long after he did this for the sisters.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. We've talked about this chapel, and these chapels all came about with the Daughters of Charity being here. So let's talk a little bit about them and their ministry and their order. So the group that came, really, the Daughters of Charity started back in Europe at some
They
point.
did, in the 1600s in France. They were the
Right.
first uncloistered order. So that means that they didn't stay in a community without interaction. They were formed to take care of the sick and the poor in the streets where they found them.
Right. And when they come to America, they eventually merge with St. Elizabeth Seton's order,
That
which
is
were
correct.
they called the Sisters
That's
of
right.
Charity. And they still wore
Cornets.
the cornets. I couldn't remember the word, thank you. They wore the cornets, and it's there. Her I guess, mother house is in Emmitsville. Emmitsburg. And so that's when they were contracted to come here.
That's right.
From there.
The doctor who wrote to the Daughters of Charity wrote to the Mother House in Emmitsburg. And they considered it for a couple of months. Louisiana was desperate. They really needed a nursing order on the ground here. And at first they rejected, and then did an about-face and accepted the mission. For them it was a religious mission, but they were also, of course, serving a function for the state government of nursing the patients. So that was in 1896. Fast forward to the 1920s when the federal government took over. They were still here. There were more than 4 sisters by that time and more than 7 patients. There were 90 patients and maybe 7 sisters. And the federal government kind of debated a little bit. Should we let them stay? Should we ask them to go? And they eventually, of course, kept the sisters and turned them into federal employees.
Is that what happened? Okay.
Yes.
Because I know when they came, they got this just like $100 for the year.
That was when it was the state.
When it was first started.
Oh, yeah, when it was first started, that's right. But eventually, they started paying them federal salaries.
Okay.
Right.
So what was the largest number, and when was it really at its max?
24, 25 sisters in the 1940s and
Okay.
50s, and then it started tapering off as the patient population started tapering off.
Okay. And these sisters, when the sisters came, they functioned in every capacity.
Right.
I mean, this was a working community with a working hospital.
Right.
So we had them as nurse. I mean, I was shocked at all the different roles these women,
yes.
from domestic work to specialty like pharmacists, nuns,
Everything.
X-ray technicians.
I believe every sister who arrived was a nurse to begin with.
Okay.
But then they diversified, like you said. We had sister dietitians, we had Of course, the sister servant would have been the chief sister, and we had sisters who ran the nursing department. We had sisters who were librarians, medical records librarians, sister pharmacist who was also a music teacher.
Oh,
so-
wow. Okay, so in that capacity, even such, where education as well as the
True.
medical field,
That's
per
true.
se. Okay. Yes, because when I read that, it was amazing, all the different, the roles
The
that
hats
they...
that they wore, along with the cornet, yeah.
That's it. So,
We had one sister who was a famous bio researcher, Sister Hilary Ross. She was also the medical photographer, as well as she took some beautiful landscapes of the grounds from the 20s, 30s, 40s.
okay. So now I do know that after Vatican II, their habits changed.
They did, yeah. The cornet became a thing of the past, and they went to a scarf.
A more traditional
Scarf, that's right.
habit.
They did, and a shortened shift. Because when you see historical photographs of the First Daughters of Charity, that was a woolen two-piece. It had a bodice and then a skirt with quite a petticoat underneath that had a dozen pockets. And then, of course, they had the cornet. And then when they were in nursing duty, they put white linen, full wrap apron around the whole thing.
So they never wore a white uniform. Because some orders have,
They
like
did
the
not.
Salesian order that taught us would wear white in the summer and they would wear black in
thought
the
that's-
winter. And I've
yeah.
seen pictures of them in the white and in the black. But what you're saying is in their role in the medical profession, they dress like, as a nurse, when I came out of school, I had the white hat, now we're all in scrubs. So I didn't realize that. I was thinking that the habit changed with the seasons because of
I
South
thought
Louisiana
so
and the
originally
heat.
too, but I was told by the sisters themselves, oh no, we wore that white linen on top of the dark blue linen and wool.
And I would imagine France and up north, wool breathes, but it's much more warmer than it is cooler.
Yeah.
Down
It
here,
had to be
it's
miserable.
totally, yeah.
They also might have wore the cornets when they were in their nursing duties, which may not be a big deal when you're at bedside, but in the surgery as well. I have photographs, and I've heard from the sisters and the doctors involved that they did wear the cornets while they were doing surgical nursing, which was a little bit dangerous.
Yes and no. I mean, you wear covers on your hair now to keep hair from
But it
falling.
would-
So, but I mean,
It
yes.
would blow
Well-
across the,
Well, not, yeah,
the
that
surgery.
and just coming in, not being covered in a sterile environment. But,
Mm.
medical technology really came about in the 1930s when penicillin was
right.
discovered. Talking about all the hats they wore in terms of their care, they also interacted with the patients socially in every aspect.
In
did they
every
not?
aspect. The sister I mentioned earlier, Sister Laura, who was one of our first pharmacists, she was also a music teacher. So of course she directed the choir here in the Catholic chapel. She also taught individual patients how to play piano, which was very good for their hands as well as
like
their
therapy.
spirit. Yes.
Sure, occupational therapy. The
Exactly.
beginnings of that profession.
Right, that's correct. And she, every Christmas, would direct a Christmas cantata, which was quite well known in the neighborhood.
So one of those social events that they had.
They'd invite
going on here.
outside people to see. That's correct.
So tell us some of the other things. I know I've seen pictures of them like in the stands for a baseball game.
They were big fans of the patients' sporting events like softball. I have the photograph you're referring to are three sisters sitting in the bleachers. Looks like they're in mid-cheer. Yeah, and they also went fishing. We had, of course, the rivers across the street, but we had a nicely stocked 20-acre lake in the back. And patients as well as the sisters went fishing back there.
So life as any of us would be, a day going fishing.
And they do they did gardening, both ornamental and little fruits and vegetables. But they did a lot for the patients that was off the books, like if they'd organized shopping sprees outside of the patients, outside of the grounds when patients weren't allowed to travel freely, and they'd shop for the patients.
And I read about that, like if they would go to Donaldsonville, sometimes they would come home with gifts for the patients from the people
always.
wherever they went. But
Always, yeah. And when there were indigent patients, the sisters would do little fundraisers for the indigent patients, as well as they'd accept donations for the patients from other community organizations, many of whom kept a relationship with the sisters and the patients for decades.
That's interesting. And when I was actually researching this towards the, like in the late 60s, six or nine of the sisters that were here, like leading up to their anniversary in 1996, I think it was 9 of them, 6 of them were from Louisiana, of the nuns themselves, the sisters themselves.
Right, that doesn't surprise me.
Which I found fascinating because so oftentimes, we know they came from Emmitsburg originally, but some of the ones that were here, Sunset, Burnside, they were not like from New Orleans. They were from rural communities around here, yeah.
Right, well, I'm going to correct you a bit and say
Sure.
that the mother house was in Emmitsburg,
Yes.
but the sisters who were missioned here were from all over the country.
Correct. Just
Actually,
the first ones came from there.
well, they were deployed from Emmitsburg, but they may have come from posts in other states.
That's true.
Yeah.
I'm thinking in terms, I know when they take their vows, plenty of times they go there to do it.
Of course.
Everybody's different. So in my mind, I'm thinking they're
Not
assigned
necessarily.
through there, but
Yes.
you're right, they come from all over. But I was really surprised, towards the end, the last group that was here, so many of them were locals from,
Right. That's
South
right.
Louisiana.
We had one
which was
sister
really
from New
interesting.
Orleans, right, Sister Rose Anthony, but we had, we had Sister Frances, who was from down the bayou, and then we had another sister from Sunset, Louisiana.
I
So
read that
yes,
one, yeah, which is right by Lafayette. So I just found that interesting that there would be a draw for them to, come
To
here.
serve
Now,
here.
did they ask to come here? Were they assigned? Do
I
how
was
that worked?
told, yes, this is what I understand, that normally sisters were missioned and went where their order sent them.
Sent them.
But I was told by Sister Frances de Sales that this was the only mission that sisters could actually reject if they or their families had, second thoughts or fears or didn't feel like they could serve. But she also told me that no sister ever turned it down, and sisters
I read
often
that.
asked
I read
to
that.
be
How much they
missioned
loved it here.
That's right.
So one last thing I know in particular, the patron saint tell us a little bit about him. It's Saint Damien, and you were able to go to Rome.
I
Tell us a little
actually
story
did.
of why he is the patron saint.
So Father Damien started as a mission priest in Hawaii, and he cared for patients in the 1900s or the 1800s. He was there late 1800s in Kalaupapa and cared for hundreds, if not maybe 1,000 leprosy patients on his own, and ended up contracting the disease and dying of complications. Well, of course he's venerated in Hawaii, but he was actually canonized in 2009, and I was able to go with the Hawaiian patients to see him canonized in Rome.
And you actually were in Hawaii at one time.
I was in Hawaii at the time for a year and worked there, for the Park Service, and helped them to begin organizing things to have a museum one day. They're not quite there. They have a different plan.
Out of curiosity, is there a statue of him anywhere here? I didn't get to Google him. I was just curious.
Yes, in the museum.
In the museum there is.
Yes,
Okay.
but in this chapel, no.
So, very good.
But he's only been canonized for just over 10 years.
Not long.
That's
not
right.
long at all. So, anything else you want to tell us about the sisters?
Ooh, gosh, there's so much.
I know. Any particular tale or story
Well,
that comes to mind?
I'll tell you this. Now, the sisters ended their mission here in 2005. Sister Dorothy Batchelow, who was a Cajun from Crowley, we think we're distant cousins, actually.
Oh, wow. How cool.
Really. She closed the mission here in 2005.
And how many were here when she closed the mission?
Patients?
No, how many of the sisters?
She was the
were here?
last sister.
She was here
There were
by
two
herself.
sisters and then one died. Sister Michael died, and so the order officially closed the mission. So Sister Dorothy, gosh, I lost track of where I was going with that.
We're talking about tales or stories about some of the things about the
So
sisters.
they've been gone, where I was going with that is they've been gone since 2005. So that's 15 years. And I've had time to think about the sisters with a little more distance, because I got close to the last seven sisters here. And they were such an integral part of our story. I mean,
being
after the
curator.
hospital, and after the hospital left, they, day in, day out, we still had patients for quite a while. I really don't think Carville would exist, and by extension, maybe even the museum, if the sisters had not taken that mission.
Right.
It would definitely be a different history here. Of course, no one can go back and change time, but without the sisters, I don't think there would have been a Carville,
And
not
the
for
love,
long.
yeah, the love that's exhibited through some of the letters.
Oh, yeah,
Tell
tremendous.
us tell a little bit about what some of the letters, because you're being curator, even though the bulk of them you were not here in the 40s when
No.
they were at their peak. You deal with their lives every day the work you do.
I do, and that's why I feel pretty, because I've looked at these letters that date back from the 1890s. I got
Exactly.
copies, thank you to the archives that was in St. Louis, the Daughters of Charity. It's now in Emmitsburg. I was invited up to take a look at those original letters and made digital copies of over 4,000
Wow.
documents, and have read them all and transcribed them because they're all handwritten. Those sisters did everything, and the detail, they were involved in every transaction that went on here intimately, and all the patient lives. So yeah, I can't separate Carville, the hospital, from the Daughters of Charity.
Right. They're such an integral part of each other.
Definitely. So we still have those hard copies we've made of the digitals, and they're available for research as well, and they're fascinating.
So they tell the life, I mean, really, because most orders, most religious orders keep their daily journals. You know, we know that. My work in New Orleans, at museum exhibits, we will visit their archives to look at the writings of their earlier sisters on their daily lives. Even like the War of 1812 with the sisters, you know, from Henriette de Lille and from the Ursulines, detail accounts of various things like that. So they tell the life that you know so intricately because of reading those.
Yes,
those papers.
and then as you learn other things and go back and read them again, different details pop out. So it's amazing. It still makes the place come alive, even though we're 125 years in the future, you know, of the establishment of the hospital in the 1890s.
And the beauty of it all is this is all showcased in the National Hansen Disease Museum, which is here on the grounds that you can visit most any day.
I'll give you the schedule, as a matter of fact. It's Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 4. We're federally funded, so we're closed federal holidays. But if you're in doubt, just give us a call. You can find us on the internet. Plan a tour soon.
And make an appointment if you want to research any of the materials that are in more depth. So thank you for being on the show today.
You're welcome, Renee.
Very good. And join us for another episode of Roots of Faith.